Good morning, History 2 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I've got notes for Chapter 15, Section 1, The Origins of the Cold War. Before we begin, you're going to want to have your handout, and you're going to need to follow along. Just on a little note here, occasionally I may mention a few little things here that are not in the guided notes. So you may want to jot those maybe to the side of your paper, maybe in the margins, because these may be things that are going to come up for your test. So let's begin. We're going to talk a little bit about the Cold War. And to kind of understand the Cold War, you kind of have to understand the end of World War II. At the end of the Second World War, we had the Soviet Union, who had occupied quite a bit of territory that the Nazis had possessed during the war itself. So areas such as like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, these were territories that were in the hands of the Russians. And in a way, some of the native peoples that lived in these places who were sympathetic to the communist cause were kind of elevated to leadership roles within these governments. So at some point in time, eventually we're going to have a government, communist government in the eastern part of Germany. And a lot of those people who are at the head of that government have always been sympathetic to the communist cause. Okay. West of there, we have basically what we would call the free part of Europe. We would have the western half of Germany, France, Great Britain, to name a few. And these are nations, for the most part, that were kind of part of the Allies, with the exception of West Germany, of course, during the Second World War. And nations that, in this case of Germany, West Germany, were occupied by the Allies, such as Great Britain, France, and the United States at the end of that war. So let's take a look at our handout here. Number one, how did the Soviet influence the political situation in Poland at the end of World War II? And this comes down to the fact that the Soviets had liberated Poland from the Germans. They occupied that area as the Russian troops were moving towards Berlin, and primarily in the beginning parts of 1945. And eventually they encouraged the Polish communists to set up a new government, which for the most part would be a puppet government of the Soviet Union. Number two, what were the differences of opinion among Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin regarding Poland's future? You know, before the war ends, the big three, as Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin were known, gathered at a place called Yalta. Yalta is along the Black Sea. Today would be kind of parts, I believe, of the Ukraine. But needless to say, Churchill and Roosevelt, kind of leading up to this, kind of had it in their opinion that, you know, there were going to be free elections. And that's kind of part of what this is all about. That the Polish people, the Poles in this case, would be able to freely choose their government by going to the polls and voting. Stalin wanted a government in Poland that was going to be friendly to the Soviet Union. Even though Stalin was supposedly our ally, he had a kind of a scheme going that when this war ended, he was going to do something to make sure that the Soviet Union would never be in a situation where they would be weak. And by having allies that were sympathetic to the communist cause, he could build himself up. Number three, what compromises about Poland's new government did Stalin agree to make at the end of the war? Stalin did agree to include former members of the Polish government and to allow free elections. Okay, it's kind of lip service. He kind of said that, but you need to remember, and this is kind of like one of those little Easter eggs where you know, little extra tidbit of information here. There were never ever free elections that were ever held in Poland. And Stalin, for the most part, didn't own up to the promise that he had made. So, in a way, countries like the United States and Great Britain um, really became very skeptical of what Stalin was up to. They kind of knew he was sneaky, but by the time we get into um, maybe after Churchill and Roosevelt are no longer leading their respective nations, we kind of know that this guy he's a shyster. We're gonna have to watch out for him. Number four, what did the Declaration of Liberated Europe give the people of Europe? Well, this declaration, for the most part, was something that was kind of like drawn up and kind of backed by the kind of the newly formed United Nations of the rights of all people to choose their own form of government. And in a way, when we talk about things that are going to kind of come along the pike after the initial days after World War II, the United States is going to see that this is a real big deal. It's not just for liberated Europe, but we're also talking about places elsewhere. The United States is going to want to intervene in parts of Asia so that the peoples of those nations can freely choose their government. And sometimes this leads to conflict. Number five, how was Germany divided at the end of World War II? And one of the things I want you to do is to take a look at this map that's kind of below here. I'm going to move my cursor here so you can see. One of the things that happens after World War II is Germany is going to be partitioned up among the different allies. In the eastern part, we're going to have a part of Germany that's going to go to the Soviets. And that's also going to include the capital city of Berlin. And there were some allied powers that were a little concerned that, the Soviets were going to have Berlin. And so the city of Berlin, if you can see kind of here in this little inset of this map, is actually divided as well, just like the rest of Germany. So in the eastern part of the city, the Russians are going to have it. And then in the west, you're going to have it divided up among the United States, which is kind of the pink, Great Britain, which is the green, and France, which is kind of the orange. At some point in time, and I'm going to go ahead and start kind of moving some of these since we talked about that. At some point in time, primarily about 1948, West Germany, which would be basically the British, US, and French sectors, are going to unite into one nation basically known as West Germany. And the East is actually going to become its own nation of East Germany. And these two nations are going to be basically divided until we get to about 1990. So, number six, what did Stalin demand from Germany after it was defeated? And Stalin, for the most part, wanted reparations. And if you remember back to World War I, reparations were one of those things that maybe were the catalyst for the Second World War. The Soviets, they wanted reparations that were going to be paid to the Soviet Union. And part of that has to do with the great cost that the Soviets basically had to endure fighting the Nazis. And it's not just, dollars and cents, but it has a lot to do with the number of lives that were lost. The Soviets, they lost millions of soldiers, but we also have to figure in the large number, and we're talking millions of civilians that died as well, fighting the Nazis for a number of years. So they wanted their fair share, and that reparations was part of it. What's interesting is when our big three went to Yalta, that was something that Stalin was asking for. Churchill was opposed to giving any reparations, but truth is, Roosevelt, who was very, very weak at the time that he went to Yalta, this is in February of 1945, just a few months before he passes away, he is willing to compromise on this. And so what ends up happening is, as the Soviets are coming into parts of Germany, they are basically going in and pillaging and finding anything of value and boxing it up and shipping it back to the Soviet Union. So in a way, what were former Nazi factories basically get moved to the east and end up in places like the Soviet Union to become new Russian factories. Number 7, how did Roosevelt suggest that Germany pay for the damages that it had caused? And part of that was with trade. We thought that, Germany could, rather than paying reparations, they could get back to starting to produce goods, particularly industrial machinery, which they had been making for years before this war began, including railroad cars and other equipment. And in a way, this might help rebuild the economy of the western part of Germany, getting people back to work, getting money in their hands so that they can go out and buy the necessities that they needed. So that was kind of our I guess you could say our belief here in the United States. And in a way, that's what we eventually set out to do. And this is even after FDR passes away. We were making sure that companies like Volkswagen, who had been started actually kind of in the 1930s at the beginning of the rise of the Nazis, rather than producing items for the Third Reich, that they would start producing consumer goods that are eventually going to be imported to the United States. So, for example, your Volkswagen Bugs, which was probably one of the more popular imported cars in the United States, kind of in the middle part of the 20th century. And we can thank some of this policy for causing that to happen. So, number 8, what was the name given to the era between 1946 and 1990, in which the United States and the Soviet Union were hostile to one another? It's known as the Cold War. And we kind of can talk about it in terms of cold. There were obviously times when there were some heated exchanges, a lot of accusations and things like that. But as far as like the United States and the Soviets actually fighting a war, not a lot of that happened. And that's the cold part of it. We were so close on a number of occasions to actually going maybe into a third world war. So in a way, that's why this is called cold. We're really kind of at each other's neck, but at the same time, no one's willing to cross that line to officially make it into a war itself. Number 9, why did the Soviets want to keep Germany weak? Germany had invaded the Soviet Union twice in 30 years, and hence the Soviets, they didn't forget that, and so they wanted to make sure Germany couldn't come back and attack them again. Number 10, what did Roosevelt believe was the key to world peace? It's all about economic growth. Economic growth are things like trade. Number 11, what did Truman believe was critical to Europe's recovery? Okay, he believed that industry, for the most part, was critical to both Germany and Europe's recovery. Got to remember, Germany had pretty much been pulverized as a result of all these years of warfare, particularly the last probably 3 years of the war, or the last 2 years of the war. There were a lot of bombing campaigns that targeted civilians and cities and such. And so, rebuilding Germany was crucial, but we can't forget about countries like France, which had also been kind of the battlegrounds, or Belgium, or even Great Britain, which had suffered a lot of bombing campaigns by the Third Reich. So we needed to rebuild all of this. Number 12, what did Truman suggest to Stalin at the Potsdam Conference regarding reparations from Germany? Just so you know, Potsdam was a conference that took place in July of 1945. This is literally about 3 months after the passing of FDR. Truman is a rookie president, and a president that, for the most part, people didn't elect. So there's a lot of concern about what he's doing there in the Oval Office. And so at this conference, Truman suggested that the Soviets take their reparations from their own zone. So in other words, from what would become East Germany. This is something that not necessarily just Truman believed, but this is kind of the plan that had already been kind of laid out for Truman by his predecessor, FDR, and a lot of the people that were working for FDR. So, while the Allies, for the most part, would allow industry to be built and to take place in their zones. So, yeah, it's kind of a slippery slope here. Number 13, after Stalin rejected Truman's suggestion, what did Truman offer as a compromise? And Truman offered additional industrial equipment from the Allied zones in exchange for food from the Soviet zone, particularly the Ukraine. If you don't know about the Ukraine is really kind of the bread belt of what used to be the Soviet Union. It has a lot in common with like states like Kansas because it produced a lot of wheat, and there was famine that was taking place at the end of the war and really kind of going into 1946. So having access to wheat could certainly help uh, thousands, if not millions, of people. And then they also offered to recognize this new Polish German border, which had been established, and not necessarily an ideal situation, but it did take place. Number 14. Which countries in Eastern Europe had pro-Soviet communist governments? That would be Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. And number 15, what was the term used to describe the communist countries of Eastern Europe? And that is something known as a satellite nation. A satellite nation is smaller nations that are kind of under the guise of a larger nation. The term Iron Curtain, and this is another little Easter egg, is actually attributed to a guy named Winston Churchill, the former Prime Minister of Great Britain. And matter of fact, what's interesting is in 1945, Winston Churchill is actually removed as Prime Minister right about the time of the Potsdam Conference. And after he leaves Parliament, or I shouldn't say Parliament, but leaves England as Prime Minister, he is eventually invited to the United States in 1946 by Harry Truman, and he ends up in a little town in Missouri, okay, where Harry Truman, he's from Missouri himself, and at this little town, he goes to this little private liberal arts college, and he gives a speech, and he talks about the dropping of this Iron Curtain across Europe, and basically kind of calls Stalin out, saying that he is sinister and he's got some other plans here, and we can't trust him. Stalin himself thought that was a huge threat to him, and was really, really angry at Churchill for making those kind of comments. Thank you very much.